Hi everybody, my name is Rick Coolbaugh and today we're going to talk about geoduck fisheries. Panopia generosa is the Latin name. This is for Aquaculture 160 of BTC Technical College. Fall 2018. Whenever I request that you move on to the next slide, please do so, such as now. Don't fear the geoduck. They might look huge, they might look mean, they might look awesome, they might even look tasty. However, they look to you. These geoducks might help fund your hatchery in the future in many a way, and there are many a way to harvest or cultivate them. We will discuss many of those reasons and the life cycle throughout this broadcast. Please continue on to the next slide. Why is a geoduck a good idea? At $20 to $30 per pound, geoducks in the South Asian market can help Northwest hatcheries funnel money in order to provide funding for shellfish such as clams and other scallops or other environmental purposes. They're good for employment. They hire a lot of people if you can grow enough of them, such as scuba divers who always need jobs. And also, shellfish are needed for healthy oceans because they are filter feeders, which is always good in every ecosystem. And they can be raised in a hatchery setting as well as they can be harvested through a fishery setting. Next slide, please. The life cycles of geoducks are much like any other bivalve. There are about 5 life cycles. 3 of these are pre-spat, whenever the larvae are developing from an egg or sperm into a fertilized larvae. Once spat, which means that this larvae has settled upon a substrate, such as another shell, the geoduck will develop and grow until it reaches the final life stage, such as sexual maturity. Once at sexual maturity, this can take 5 to 7 years to reach, it will be able to continuously reproduce for a very long time, as the seasons will predict. This is going to be explained later on. Next slide, please. As broadcast spawners, the gametes are free floating in the water column, where they meet up and then they develop into a fertilized egg. That fertilized egg becomes the larvae, as you can see in the in the previous slide. Spawning is induced through the warming of the water. You can do this in a hatchery setting through thermal shock induction, or this can happen in nature through the changing of the seasons. Next slide, please. Larvae are free floating in the water column, and while they do so, they are feeding upon the phytoplankton. As you can see in the photo to the left, you have geoduck larvae. They are very small, and that is a microscopic image. To the right, you have algae, which is being cultured for the feeding of various shellfish. Various algae are needed for the various times and phases of the life stages of the various shellfish. Thus, many different types of algae are being grown within that laboratory. Algae culturing is just about as important to any shellfish hatchery as the shellfish hatchery, or shellfish culturing in itself. Honestly, if you can't manage your algae, then you can't manage your shellfish because you have nothing to feed it with. Please move on to the next slide. Here you can see spat underneath a microscope. This image was taken by myself in one of the many laboratories that we visited. I believe it was Lummi Hatchery. Weekly monitoring within the hatchery is necessary. We would go over, and such indications of health would be the size and the growth over time of the shellfish, or the mortality rates, how many of them are dying and at what rate and why possibly. And one of these indicators could be water quality. We can in culturing the spat, we are constantly looking at different monitorization, such as temperature of the water, salinity of the water, the DO of the water, and many other factors. And this can be done within upwelling or downwelling tanks as well. Of course, it has to be said that within a hatchery setting, you are also culturing your algae. Now, within a fishery setting, we would honestly be going around and taking surveys such as WDFW does whenever opportunistic, which only happens around 20 times a year, which we'll get into later for the reasons why. But surveys of population rates, size, and densities and locations whereof, all of that can be better understood and help us manage the ecosystem in a natural setting further than fisheries to harvest the geoducks. So if you see in there, you can indicate that many different sizes and there's different little things. And if you are a biologist or know what you're looking for, which I do not, then you will be able to tell that there's some weird stuff in those little oyster shells that one of the ladies at Lummi Hatchery was able to point out and suddenly almost had a heart attack in noticing. And apparently that would indicate a soon-to-be crash. So it's very important to do persistent or constant monitoring of your system. Next slide, please. So once they're spat, these geoducks need a safe place to hide because they're too big to fit into their shell. By using hydraulics to burrow into the sand, these geoducks are able to dig very deep and they're able to find a nice little cozy place to hide. They have little siphons, as you can see in the diagram to the right, that allow them to filter feed and as well, of course, breathe and get all of their needed whatnots, nutrients. And this is very, very awesome because not many of the shellfish bivalves that we study actually burrow down into the sand. And this is also another reason why they're very hard or difficult to cultivate as a fishery. However, we will get to some techniques later on. I imagine that they move around, however, I am not certain. We can look into that further on. Thank you. Next slide, please. One of the fastest growing bivalves, so these guys are pretty awesome for rearing in a hatchery or fishery outplanting setting or whatnot, and they're worth a lot of money. They grow really, really fast, although it does take a long time. You get a lot of weight out of the time you put into it, as opposed to other bivalves. So if it takes 3 years for an oyster or 5 years for an oyster to be mature and ready for harvest, then how big is that in size compared to, let's say, a geoduck, which is probably 4 times its size. So they're pretty amazing. And we are also lucky here to have great waters for growing them, which is pretty rare. As well, we don't have much sandy beaches, but our hatchery settings are another good alternative if we don't take advantage of our fishery settings. So I do not believe that photo is real. However, geoducks live really, really, really old, and that's pretty cool. And there is an equation to be able to understand their growth rate, capacity, fecundity, and all of that over the years. And apparently geoducks can live up to 168 years old, but I'm willing to bet that they can live much older than that. We just don't know about it. But in all honesty, for fishery outplanting setting, other than natural harvest, we should probably, in my opinion, let the big ones stay and harvest the medium size, so that way we keep some biodiversity in there. But that's just my speculations or my theories. Next slide, please. So, in saying that the geoducks are really old in age if they want to be, they can also reproduce for a long time, which is pretty awesome. So you could have a brood stock that you keep around. You could have a little geoduck friend that lives beyond you. Like, that'd be pretty crazy as a hatchery manager. But in a fishery setting, I assume that they need to harvest at a certain rate, but once again, I say caution, you should not just go around harvesting the largest of the large. You should probably allow some biodiversity to maintain within an ecosystem, and that's just my speculation. Next slide, please. They eat phytoplankton throughout their life. Yeah, these giant geoducks aren't going around eating sharks or other things like that. No, they eat whatever's floating in the water column, and they clean it, and it's pretty neat. These guys live. The phytoplankton are phytoplankton, which means that they live off of light, which is algae and other forms, like diatoms and other things. And you can culture these things in a lab, but as well they grow naturally in the ocean. So if you were to outplant a geoduck, you wouldn't have to go around and sprinkle algae or anything like that once a day. No, it naturally just filter feeds it through its system, and as well, through doing that, it lessens the turbidity of the water, which helps the light grow more phytoplankton, which in turn is like the cycle of life, like go Mufasa, you know? So, yeah. Alright, next slide, please. Human predation, that's us. So, ways that we do this is through multiple forms. One of the most efficient one, if you're actually going to be a fishery that harvests geoducks for sale to commercial markets, would be scuba, which stands for self-contained underwater breathing apparatus, which was developed way back in the day by some awesome people. And today, in order to harvest geoducks, we use this suction hoses, such as the water jet. And the water jet's really neat because it's been shown to like reduce the damage done to the ecosystem around the geoducks, and it depletes the amount of damage it does to bycatch and other like plants and stuff in the area, because it's very precise. You're not like digging up a hole, but that is a possibility, as you will see later. There's also PVC piping that you can use like a suction, and that's one entertaining form to watch. It seems kind of ridiculous, but yeah, for geoduck, okay. For other forms, it might be a little bit better suited because they're smaller, but if you have a big enough PVC pipe and plunger, then you could just suck up the geoduck from its little hole that it buried itself into. There are all sorts of methods, so check out this really cool video of people using scuba and what is a water jet to suck up some of the geoducks. If you want to, then you can stop the video whatnot right now and check that out, or wait till later. There's a hyperlink provided. I highly recommend it. It's only 1 minute, so it won't take much long. Alright, moving on. Please continue on the next slide. So that's another method you could do. Yep, these guys look real like they're having fun. That sounds like a good day on the beach to me, getting their dinner. It's a lot of work though for one geoduck, and I don't think that their methodology is very effective. But regardless, yeah, you can dig for them, but that's not how you do it. Alright, next slide please. So, how is it regulated? Who can harvest geoducks and when? Commercial and recreational seasons are established within the Puget Sound by Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. That was posted by the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, obviously, as of 2018. And there are many, you can find information at their website. Are many regulations, and the seasons change continually. You never know. It could be an opener, it could be a closer, or it could be rec, or it could be sport, or it could be tribal. You never know. So you got to make sure that you follow the regulations online and have your proper licensings, and don't just go out with a bucket one day with not knowing what you're doing. You should find and research and get your appropriate licensing before you do any geoduck fishing or hunting or harvesting, whatever you want to call it. As well, this is for your own health, because there's biotoxins in the water, and that could be really, really, really bad for you, especially if you eat it raw. So be cautious. And even if there is an opening, be cautious about your own catch, your own harvest. Make sure that you know what you're doing. Next slide, please. And geoduck limits and catch limits are really, really good, because they allow the geoduck populations to replenish. It's not because they just randomly want to close it down. No, they close the geoduck season because they know when geoducks are going to reproduce. And if they know when geoducks are going to reproduce, then they're able to make sure that there's enough geoducks for you to harvest, especially if you're a fishery or a hatchery manager, such as outplanting for hatchery. Regardless, catch limits and season openings and closings are regulated by WDFW within Puget Sound waters, and it is a good idea to pay attention and understand why that is happening. You want geoducks, and if you take them all away, then there won't be any there tomorrow. Next slide, please. And geoduck harvesting, as we talked about earlier, takes care of the environment. Geoduck is worth a lot of money, as we talked about earlier, and so all that money, some of it goes back into establishing a healthy environment for the geoduck. That environment not only is good for the geoduck, but is also good for many other species. Those other species include Pacific oysters. They could include crazy amount of any other species. Algae. It could help reduce the amount of eutrophication within the water. You name it, geoducks, other bivalves, other species of sea kelps, whatnot, are all good for the environment. So, through the geoduck money, Washington State has been able to find a way to funnel it back into directly helping the environment. And that is pretty neat. If other areas did that with other bivalves, then that would be a really great turnout, and go Washington State for doing that. Next slide, please. And so whenever I was talking about other areas doing it, these guys are helpful from California all the way to Alaska. That's pretty cool. So at the end of the day, if you went from California, or if you were in Alaska and you were to invest in geoduck today, then you would be profiting, hopefully tomorrow. Because honestly, if there's a sandy beach and water that is -2 feet below the normal tide, then you got a good enough area to harvest geoducks, even if it's hatchery or fishery. But you need to have the substrate that they can burrow into, and they have to be kind of deep. And the deeper the better. So keep that in mind. Next slide, please. Now we're going to talk about Ostrom's principles and how they might affect geoduck production. Defining principle number 1, defining group boundaries. This deals with like concepts of who may harvest or farm geoducks, and what other species might be affected, why, where. Like if you threw in a bunch of geoducks into an area, they're going to compete with the oyster, or are they going to overeat, like, or deplete the, or do something good like prevent eutrophication because of an algae bloom. And in what form are you doing it? Are you doing hatchery or fishery? Are you outplanting? What are you doing in general? All of these need to be understood, and you need to manage your stock populations with consideration of the natural ecosystem. You can't just go around stomping around the world. Next slide. Principle number 2, you need localized rules. These are needed because every area is different. Lego Bay is different than Bellingham Bay, which is different than Cherry Point, which is different than Fairhaven Bay. So each area needs to understand what it's doing in its own environment. Number 3, community makes the rules. You need to make the rules based upon an understanding of the reason. You can't just go around saying people can't do things, or they can do things because that is like the overall consensus without any logical scientific bearing. You have to understand what you're doing. You can't tell Lay from Lego Bay that she can't dump her effluent to the ocean whenever it's not a problem, but if anything might actually be good for that ecosystem. So the spirit of the law, understand what the law actually means. Next slide, please. Principle number 4, you need to protect the community rights. You need to make sure that the economy is taken care of. Subsidies need to be understood and considered before you start up a fishery or hatchery. You need to understand that if you have rapid unemployment, then that's not going to be good for anyone, not for the geoduck and not for the humans that are relied upon them, nor for the businesses that sell them. So you need to understand how to make a sustainable economic fishery, as well as make it sustainable for the environment. But it also needs to be sustainable for the people. I believe that is very influential and can be understood, and a good example would be the cod industry of Newfoundland during 1986. Or 1991, I believe it was, 91 or 92. Sorry. Alright. Next slide, please. Principle number 5. So the fishermen need to be regulated, sadly. We can't just put out all of our faith that they will do the right thing all the time. However, that will be addressed later. But at the end of the day, the fishermen do need some form of community policing or overwatch to make sure that what is being proposed as a good regulation is actually being followed. Next slide, please. Number 6. So, the more you mess up, the more you should be punished and slapped on the wrist. And that makes sense. So, we can help people correct bad behavior, such as previous example, or previous principle number 5. If a fisherman were to break the law and was caught by law enforcement, then the more he did so, then the more he would be in trouble would become. That's a pretty good idea in general for the general public. Next slide, please. Principle number 7. You can't make it too expensive to dispute rights. Should make it affordable for everybody, and it should be easy to do so and on a timely basis, because catch shares, limits, openings, closings change rapidly, so that needs to be controlled and not overly bureaucratized, or can't be a giant bureaucracy doing it. It needs to be people right there with their hands in the water actually making decisions with those who understand the science behind why those decisions matter. Next slide, please. Principle number 8, multiple levels of community involvement. That means everybody, as I've been saying the whole time, everybody from the fishermen to the politicians to the person that's selling it to the person that's filleting it and putting it on the market shelf or in the cooler. They all need to have a say in it, and not one of them needs to be hurt if there's a moratorium. Not one of them needs to be hurt if they lose their job. Everybody needs to be accounted for within this industry, or either you're going to lose it. That's my opinion. But hopefully, if everybody works together, we can all get along. That'd be really great. And finally, no one profits from the overharvesting. Let's all take it easy whenever we need to. That's why we set regulations. Those are some awesome gooey ducks growing there. And this is a guy working pretty darn hard. And then enjoy it whenever you can. Because gooey ducks are good for you. They're good for the environment. They give jobs. Good jobs for rare jobs. Everybody wants to be a scuba diver at one point in their fisheries thing. I think I do, and that would be a great job to be a scuba vacuumer. That's what I would call myself. And in the end, thank you very much for everybody that helped, from Lego Bay to Lummi Nation Shellfish Hatchery. You all help us so much. All of us students learn about shellfish. I really appreciate it. Sorry, next slide. Thank you. And thank you very much. Have a good one. And these are my references if you go to the next slide. And that's it. Enjoy. I hope you enjoy shellfish, and I hope you enjoy gooey duck. I have never personally tried one, but someday I will plan to. Thank you.